Hi there. This is Sam Schiffman, and I'd like to talk to you today about leveraging AI to bring effective automation to healthcare. But why do we need to bring automation to healthcare at all? Well, healthcare today is in crisis. It's facing a number of really big challenges, one of them being a shortage in clinicians. We see clinicians and medical professionals leaving the field in droves every day. Some of this due to retirement, some of it due to burnout from the stresses of the current system. At the same time, we see an expansion in the need for care. We have an aging population. The U.S. Census Bureau tells us that in 2034, there'll be more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18 for the first time in recorded history. And older people see more specialists, they have more complications, they have more chronic problems, and they generally just need more care. At the same time, there is an explosion of knowledge in healthcare. The number of research papers published every day is astronomical. Some estimates say that the amount of knowledge in healthcare doubles every 72 days. That's a lot to keep track of. And at the same time, the problems that we're dealing with are evolving. You are far more likely today to die from cancer or heart disease or complications from diabetes or Alzheimer's than you are from an acute problem like an accident or a violent act. And all of these combine together to add pressure. It's our explosion of knowledge that's allowing us to live longer, but we're living longer, we're seeing more of these evolving chronic problems, and all of this is circling back to add more and more pressure on clinicians. Now, other fields have faced similar problems, and they've addressed them with automation. However, automation and healthcare don't always mix real well. Why is that? Well, first off, humans are complex. There are many more parameters involved in human healthcare than there are in the most complicated financial transactions out there. Also, individuals are unique. If you work in, say, car manufacturing and your job is to put bolts in that hold the door, if you pick up a bolt out of the bin that is malformed, wasn't manufactured quite to spec, you can just throw it away and grab another one. Well, we can't just throw away people. And people also have different approaches to what is the best outcome for them. You know, one person facing a terminal condition might well decide that they want to go home and spend their remaining time with their family and loved ones. Another person facing a terminal condition may decide that they want every form of medical intervention possible. Both of these are reasonable approaches, and that makes it very difficult to distill down to the kind of automation that we've traditionally had. So, what would make for successful automation in healthcare? Well, first, it needs to be based on the most up to date best practices that come from evidence based research. It needs to have a good understanding of the current state of the patient and what their history is. It needs to take all that and distill it into a personalized plan for that patient, which is reviewed and managed by a clinician. We cannot remove the expert from the system, but we need to extend that expert beyond the encounter, beyond just the visit between the clinician and the patient. Care needs to go through all of the patient's life. Now, luckily, we have some tech that's starting to catch up to the ability to do this. We are starting to see new standards evolve every day that are enabling interoperability of healthcare data at scale. We also see new technology that's able to manage massive data sets at scale so that we can finally make sense of all of this health data. And we have new tools like generative AI that is helping us to to be able to understand data in new ways and allow computers to actually help us in this process. So what could this look like? Well, let me introduce you to Don O'Connell. Uh, Don is retired from the Air Force, and unfortunately, in 2022, he did come down with COVID. He survived, but he had a terrible experience in the hospital, and he hasn't wanted to go see a doctor since. Now, recently, Don's daughter convinced him that he really did need to be seen by somebody, and so he went into a VA facility and was seen by a new primary care who was just given this information about Don in order to address his care. Now, luckily, the VA actually has published clinical practice guidelines that might well apply to Don. Um, so, what is a clinical practice guideline? So, first, it's when a health institution gets a group of its experts and clinicians together and says, you go look at all of the evidence, best practice, and clinical research around this particular condition, such as diabetes, and distill it all down to a set of recommendations that we can publish in a single document that a clinician can look at and use to deliver care. That's great, but there are some challenges. First off, CPGs are presented in a narrative form, which is good for a clinician, but not so good when we want to involve a computer. Also, they tend to be long. These are the lengths of those 3 CPGs that I put up before, but they're actually kind of on the short side for CPGs. They also include a lot of non-treatment oriented information. This is important information, such as the methodology behind how the recommendations were come to, but not information that directly is related to how to treat the patient. They are specific to a particular condition most of the time. So, for example, the 3 that I showed you, diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, are 3 completely separate documents published by the VA. And they often contain some contradictions, both internally and across multiple CPDs, as they've been developed by different panels of experts and based on different research and different evidence. They don't always quite line up. So what we'd like to do, we'd like to be able to take all that information, we'd like to be able to present a clinical pathway for Don that makes sense, right? So, for example, Don's BMI clearly indicates that he would be a good candidate for bariatric surgery. But Don may or may not decide that he wants to have that surgery, which is perfectly fine, right? But even if he does want to have that surgery, he really does need to reduce his BMI. It's a qualification for getting the surgery. So we're going to refer Don to a dietitian and an exercise physical therapist to address his weight loss, right? But we don't want to just refer him and drop it, right? We want to check in with him to make sure that he's meeting his goals. Similarly, we want to make sure that Don's taking his medications, right? And we need to check with the pharmacy to make sure that he's actually filling those medications. And if he's not, we want somebody to reach out to him to make sure that he is. Now, this last one's a little bit interesting. Don did not present with high blood pressure, but the CPG on hypertension talks about a condition called masked hypertension, which is when a patient comes in and doesn't present with high blood pressure, but has many of the comorbidities that would indicate that they have it, right? And it recommends that maybe you should check at home to make sure that their blood pressure isn't elevated outside of the office. So how do we get to that? How do we go from those CPGs to that kind of clinical pathway? Well, this is where the clinical insight automation platform comes in. And we're going to step through each of these pieces here and understand how it arrives at the ability to execute that kind of pathway for Dawn. But we need to understand a concept before we can go there, and that is a knowledge graph. What is a knowledge graph? Well, these are some sentences of information about speeds of things, and we can represent this as a set of circles, which we call nodes, and lines which connect them, which we call edges. And the edges give some context, and we can rearrange this in this sort of graph format, which is a really powerful thing. It lets us say things like, okay, a dog's top speed is 45 miles an hour, right? And that the dog is an animal. But it lets us also infer that a dog is not a vehicle because the dog is not connected to that part of the graph. This structure allows us to do some really powerful things, and we're going to talk about two knowledge graphs that we're going to build. And the first one is going to be that knowledge graph based on the CPGs, where we're going to bring them in and enrich them. Now, as we do that, we need to figure out how do we create the nodes for a CPG. I mean, we could just take each paragraph and create a node in the graph for it, right? But that's not as smart as we can be. We can look at those CPGs and realize that they have headings and subheadings in them, which provide a kind of structure that allow us to bring it into the graph in a much more structured way. And we can bring in multiple CPGs this way, right? But at this point, they're completely separate from each other, and we'd like to be able to link them together. So what do we need to do that? We need to find some concepts that are in the text, and we can do that by using medically trained natural language processing that can take a look at the text and pull out particular concepts that are in that text. And then we can combine those concepts together, which will naturally create links within the CPG and across CPGs. Now, these concepts might not always be quite the same. I mean, for example, one CPG might talk about stitches, while another CPG talks about sutures, right? Those are really the same thing. They're just being talked about slightly differently. So how do we link those concepts? Well, in order to do that, we need to understand a concept called semantic distance. And what is that? Well, in order to understand that, we actually need to understand vector embedding. Okay, so vector embedding is really a fancy way of saying we're going to assign some coordinates to words, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to initially assign just total random coordinates, and then we're going to pump in a bunch of text, and the closer that things are to each other in that text, it's going to push them closer together in this what we call vector space, right? And that's going to give us these coordinates for these words. And from that, we can start to make inferences. For example, dog is close to cat, right? And it's not as close to truck as it is to cat, but it's a lot closer to truck than it is to speed, right? And using this kind of semantic distance calculations, we're able to start to build those concepts together that we need to combine. So this is great. This gives us a linked set of CPGs, but we can do better. We can go beyond that. And what we can do is we can engage an LLM. Now, we don't want to just give the large language model the entire CPG and ask it to do something with it, because among other things, it might hallucinate. It'd be really hard for us to know that that's going on. A much smarter approach is to ask the LLM targeted questions about specific sections in the CPG. For example, we might ask it, is this section even relevant to treatment? Or we might ask it, what is the criteria that would need to be true about a patient in order for this section to apply to them? We can even ask it to express that in a computable programming language. And there's an example of doing some of this in a talk I gave on CPG to BPMM, which I will link here. All this together gives us a very rich knowledge graph of the CPGs and some understanding of the pieces within the CPGs that will let us to do some interesting things later. But in order to do that, we first need to understand the patient health data and bring it into its own knowledge graph. Patient health data can come in a lot of different formats, right? There are the HL7 standards such as FHIR that contain clinical data. There's a standard of X12, which is for administrative or cost data. There's all kinds of formats in which wearables might come in, or monitoring devices that the patient has in their house. We need to bring all that in, and we need to convert it to a common format that we can work with. So how are we going to do that? Well, again, we can leverage an LLM, but we don't want to just give the LLM the data and ask it back in that format, because it might hallucinate again and do some bad things. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask the LLM to generate a script or programming language that actually does the translation for us. And then we can validate that script that it's actually doing what we want it to do, and we can monitor it over time. So that's great. It gets that structured data converted into the common format. But there's also unstructured data in the form of clinical notes and radiology reports that we really want to be able to access. So we can again leverage that medically trained NLP to go into that unstructured data and pull out concepts that are of interest and create the associated clinical records and pull that all into our patient health data graph. Once it's there, though, we still need to do some work to harmonize it. Each piece of that data is coming from a different clinician using a different system for different purposes, and they may have entered things slightly differently and used this different codes that actually kind of mean the same thing, and we need to harmonize all of that together. We also need to consolidate it because health data often is repetitive. You see multiple clinicians listing the same allergies, listing the same conditions over and over again, just because of the nature of how healthcare works. And that adds a lot of noise to the data that we want to reduce. So all of this comes together to let us have a really good picture of the patient at the current time and all the information about them. Now we can use these two knowledge graphs to recommend a personalized clinical pathway. So let's look at that, right? The first thing we need to do is do the linkage between the personal health data and the CPGs. And we can do that in two ways. We can do that again using the semantic distance, where we say, okay, this concept looks like this condition, and that's part of this section, so let's use that section as to inform the treatment. We can also use those rules which the LLM extracted and actually run those against the patient data to say what sections apply. Combining these two together, we're able to recommend a personalized clinical pathway that could make sense for the patient. Now, as we recommend it, we're bringing it to the clinician. We're representing it in this kind of graphical format that's hopefully pretty easy for the clinician to get their head wrapped around. But we also want to give them the comfort of understanding where it comes from. So, for example, we see this tooltip over the home BP monitoring, which is showing the clinician where in the original CPG it came up with this recommendation, right? We also realize that we're going to recommend this to the clinician, but the clinician may have better ways of approaching the care. A very simple example, I mean, you look again that if the Don is not filling his medications, it reaches out to a nurse. But what if the clinician wants to refine that? What if instead the clinician says, Don's daughter is a really active part of his health care. Why don't we notify Don's daughter first and let her reach out to him and find out what's going on with his medications and make it very personal and able for him to um, not feel threatened and not feel invaded, right? So after the clinician has refined it and has approved it, they want to execute this clinical pathway, right? So the system allows them to execute that clinical pathway in a system that allows to interact with the health record, with labs, with the care team, with the loved ones, also with automated systems, so wearables that might be collecting data, uh, but also with systems that could reach out to Don. For example, we want to make sure that Don's taking his blood pressure. Why don't we have the system send him a text asking him what his current blood pressure is rather than having somebody call him all the time? So we can execute this for Don, but as we're doing that, it's very important that we continually review if this is the right path forward for Don. And we can do that by continuously recreating the recommended pathway and comparing it to the current pathway that he's on. And if we find that there's significant difference, we can alert the clinician and ask the clinician, should we change the pathway or not? So what does all this do for Don? Well, first off, it enables him to have the most up-to-date evidence-based care delivered. It also allows that care to be extended beyond the encounter, right? The clinician doesn't have time to call Don every day to make sure that he's taking his meds, but the system could reach out to Don on a regular basis. It has the monitoring that's necessary to make sure that the care that's going on is continually the best care possible. It can alert the clinician and continuously review the care path that Don is on. And all of this is going to drive much better outcomes for Don in the long run. So how does this come together to answer those problems that we talked about? Well, first it's extending the clinician. It is not going to be replacing the clinician. That's not our goal here, but our goal is to extend the clinician and allow them to care for Don past the point of the encounter, but also to care for more patients with less work. It's going to help with that aging population in a number of different ways, but one of them is to enable them to stay in their homes past the point at which they would normally have to go into an assisted living or extended care facility, which is something that most people much prefer. It's going to help with that explosion of knowledge because it's constantly refining that knowledge down into these care pathways that the clinician can then easily consume, modify, and apply to their patients. And it's extending the care beyond the encounter so that we can start to address some of the evolving problems of chronic conditions that patients are facing today. So I hope that shows you how the clinical insight automation platform could really have a huge impact on healthcare. I'd love to talk more with you about it. You can reach out to me through this QR code or look up Health Forge Consulting. If you want to hear more about my ideas of technology in healthcare, please subscribe to my channel or click on one of these playlists here. I hope you have a great rest of your day.